The Next-Auth package just released an update that now supports the new Next.js 13 route handlers. And in this video, we're going to use that to set up authentication in our Next.js app. We're going to build this simple application together where we would have some protected pages on the server and also the client, and also some protected API routes. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full stack web developer, and here on this channel, we talk about modern web dev topics like React and Next.js. So let's go. I've started with a brand new Next.js app by running pnpx create next app with the latest flag. And if you're not familiar with that, you could just head to your terminal, type in pnpx or npx if you prefer npm, and then create next app. You can add this latest flag to get the latest version. There is no longer need to pass in the experimental app flag to this, because this command, it's going to ask you if you want to set up your project with the app directory. It is going to also ask you about TypeScript, ESLint, and recently added Tailwind CSS. So you can just set up your project right off the bat with Tailwind CSS. And that's exactly what I've done here. I've set it up with Tailwind CSS. I'm going to walk you through how to set up Next-Auth and explain what I've done inside my app folder to create different pages that we need and to protect our routes, different pages, and API endpoints. So let's go to the Next-Auth documentation site where we can install Next-Auth. I've done this, so if you want, you can also do this if you're coding along with me here. I'm also going to include a link to the source code for the GitHub repository. So if you want to peek and see what we have done or the final version of our application, you can just do that. But following the steps inside the getting started section of the Next.js documentation, we can install the Next-Auth package, and then we have to initialize the Next-Auth by adding this catch-all API route to our pages API folders. Now, this is for when we didn't have the new route handlers in the app folder, and also when the Next-Auth package didn't support the new route handlers. But as you can see here, if you're using Next.js 13.2 or above inside the app router, we can now initialize the config of our Next-Auth inside of our route handlers, and that's what we're going to do. Now, if you don't want to use the app directory, you can still initialize your Next-Auth config inside of the pages folder. I actually have a video on the channel where I'm adding authentication to Next.js 13, but I'm using the pages directory to initialize Next-Auth. But in this video, we're going to use the route handlers that was introduced in Next.js 13.2, which is the equivalent of our API endpoints, but inside the app directory to also initialize Next-Auth. And if you're not familiar with the route handlers, which are your new API endpoints inside the app directory, there is a dedicated video on the channel. I'll link it somewhere in the card that talks about the new route handlers and how you need to use them. In this video, I assume that you have already seen that, or you already know how to use the route handlers, and we're going to just set up the Next-Auth. Now, following on this guide that they've included the link here in the docs, as you can see here, the process of initializing the Next-Auth config inside of the app directory is very similar to what we used to do inside the pages directory, where we would define some options and pass those options to this Next-Auth function we're getting from the package. Now, the only difference inside the app directory is that we're exporting this handler that's returned from calling this Next-Auth function and passing in our options to it. We're exporting it as get and as post. And this has to do with the new route handlers in Next.js 13.2, where you need to export name functions from your routes that will respond to that specific request. So if it's a get request or a post request, you need to have named functions to handle those requests. Now, this catch-all route from Next-Auth is going to create different functions for get and post to this endpoint and handle your authentication with just exporting this function, similar to what we were doing in the pages directory. Now, a side note here that we didn't have to put this new route TS or JS file inside of the API folder that you can see here. If I go back to my app, you can see I have this API folder created. Inside of it, I have this auth folder. Inside of it, I have this catch all Next-Auth folder. And inside of it, there is a route.js. Now inside the app directory, you don't have to put it in API folder. You could just include this route.js or TS files inside any of these folders, and we'll turn that path into an endpoint. The only limitation is that it cannot live at the same level as a page or layout, because in that case, Next.js doesn't know if you're trying to hit the endpoint or if you're trying to get the page itself. But to make this easy, as it's recommended inside this Next-Auth documentation, we are putting it inside the API, inside the auth folder, and that's exactly the pattern we were doing it in the pages directory. So we're just doing the same thing, so it makes the migration easier. So let's go to my route.js file and see what we're doing here. Now, as you can see, I have defined some auth options, and specifically my providers. I'm only going to be using Google provider. On the site, you can see there is the email kind of option for signing in with magic links or passwordless links. I haven't set that up in this video. I have a different video on the channel where I talk about different options, strategies, and providers in Next-Auth. That was in Next.js 12 on the pages directory. The concepts and providers are exactly the same, so you can use that video if you wish to set up passwordless magic link or email provider for your sign methods. You just have to add in the node mailer package to be able to send the emails. You have to have an SMTP server set up to actually send those emails. But as I mentioned, I have explained already in that separate video how you can set that up. Here, we're just going to use the Google OAuth as a social login because that's easy. All you need to do to set this up is to import this Google provider from Next-Auth providers. And we're going to have to pass in the client ID and client secret. For this, I've created a .env.example here that tells you the stuff you need to be passing into Next-Auth for it to work correctly. First one is the Next-Auth secret. This is a secret that used to sign JSON Web Tokens. The Next-Auth URL is whether you're running it from localhost. In this case, it is. And in production is going to be the domain of your application. The client ID and client secret from Google, you can get it from your Google console. You can go and open up a new project, add some API credentials, and get the client ID and client secret. Bring them back here and set them up inside of your .env.local. So the Next-Auth package can read them and create this provider for you. The other thing that I am passing in is this pages option to my auth options. And I'm saying for the sign in page, I want to use this /sign in path. Now, if you don't provide any pages to Next-Auth, it comes built in with some pages, sign in, sign out, verification, and error pages. But if you wish to customize any of those pages, you could include the path to those pages here. So Next-Auth would use these pages for those specific actions and use the rest if you haven't provided anything. Now I'm creating this handler by calling this Next-Auth function, passing in my options, and I'm exporting this handler as get and post, just as how we saw it inside the documentation. Now that we have initialized our Next-Auth config, let's just go back to the getting started guide and move to the next step. The next step is to actually share the session state with our client-side components. For that, we're going to use this session provider component from Next-Auth, which is a context provider, and we're going to wrap our components with this session provider. Now, inside of the pages directory, you would do this inside of your custom app component or _app file, where you could just get the page component and wrap it with this context providers. Now, inside of the app directory, we don't have the _app, but we do have this main root layout that's representing, or it's a combination of our _app and _document.js in the pages directory. So let's quickly look at here in the layout. This is where we're defining our root layout. This is the outermost layout of our app folder, which represents the root layout of our whole application. If you're not familiar or comfortable with how the structure is inside of the app directory, I would include a playlist in the card somewhere where I walk through this new concept of layouts and segments and routes to get comfortable with. But basically, this is our root layout, and all of our children page components are going to be plugged in here. So what I've done here is I've included a header, which is a simple header we're going to look at together. There's a footer over here as well, and then any page would just be plugged inside of this main tag. I'm using the new metadata API. Again, there's a dedicated video for this. I have a video for every update that came out from the Next.js team on the Next.js 13. So check the playlist out if you're wondering about this metadata API or the new Next font, which is very easy to set up in the app directory here. As you can see, I'm using the Inter font. Now for the provider itself, I'm using this custom client component that I have here, provider. So let's see how this looks. This is a client component. As you can see up top, we are instructing Next.js with this use client directive because mainly we want to use this session provider, which is a context provider using React context. So it needs to be a client component. That's why we're using that use client directive up top. And what I'm doing is that I'm wrapping this children that's passed to this provider component with the session provider that we're getting from Next-Auth. So just like how here we would just wrap our page components with this session provider component, I'm now wrapping my pages over here. So going back to the layout, you can see everything that's going to be rendered inside of our app directory is going to be inside of our root layout, unless you have different route groups and different root layouts. But in this case, I only have one root layout, and every page is going to be plugged in here. So therefore, it's going to be inside of this session provider, which is a React context provider. So therefore, any client-side component that needs to get access to the user or to the current session, they now can use the use session, which uses the use context hook under the hood to get access to the session. So now that we have this provider, let's actually look at a client-side page that is using that session. Now, as you can see here in my main navigation, I have two pages. One is a protected page on the server. The other one is a protected page on the client. So let's go to the app, to this protected folder. You see there is a client and a server. Let's start from the client page. Now, as you can see here, we are using this use client directive up top to instruct Next.js that this is a client-side page, mainly because we're using the use session hook, which is a React hook from the Next-Auth package that allows us to check whether or not the user is logged in. Now, something that you can do with this hook is to pass in required true option, which basically turns this page into a protected page. So it requires the user to always have a session or the user to be logged in to be able to see this page. And if they're not logged in, they're going to be redirected back to the sign-in page from where they can complete the sign-in flow, and they'll be then taken back to this page. So that's the default behavior. Another option that you can pass in here is this unauthenticated function that you can pass into the use session, which tells Next-Auth what should happen on this page once the user is not logged in. And as you can see, I'm using this redirect function that I imported from Next Navigation to redirect the user to the sign-in page. And I'm also manually setting this callback URL pointing to this protected client route so that they're just redirected back to this protected page once they completed the sign-in flow. Now, this is supposed to be the default behavior and is the default behavior of the use session hook once you pass in this required true option. But for some reason, it's not working inside the app directory. It works, but the only thing that it fails to do is to actually set the correct callback URL. Maybe it cannot access the paths inside of the app directory quite yet. It redirects back to the home page. So it works, it protects this page, and if you're not logged in, it will redirect you back to the sign-in page where you can continue the sign-in flow. But once the sign-in flow is done, it has to bring me back to this protected page. It fails on that part. It just brings me back to the home page. So to bypass that, I'm passing in my own unauthenticated function here, which just tells Next-Auth what should happen on this page once we have an unauthenticated user. I'm just saying redirect them back to the sign-in URL, and I'm manually setting this callback URL. so that I make sure once they completed the sign-in, they're back to the protected page. So it'll make more sense if we see this in action. So let's go back to our application. If I'm trying to access this protected page on the client and I'm not currently signed in, I'll be redirected back to the sign-in page, as you can see here, and the callback URL is set to protected client. So once I go ahead and try to log in with my account, I'm back in the protected page on the client side. As you can see, I'm signed in as Hamed, and then you can see my avatar up top there, indicating that the user is logged in. Now, just to show you what would happen if I do not include this manual redirection that we did, to show you what needs to happen and doesn't quite happen inside of the app router. So if I am right now signing out of my account, I'm on the home page, signed out. So if I try to access the protected page on the client side, I'm redirected back to the sign-in page. Now, as you can see here, it did set a callback URL, but it is setting it to the home page and not to the protected page. So once I go ahead and sign in from here, instead of it bringing me back to the protected page, it just goes back to the home page. And if you wanted to have this extra step or functionality, you can just add this unauthenticated function. That's a callback you can call. So with this, if I just sign out, if I go back to try to access a protected page on the client side, I'll be taken to the sign-in page, and this callback is now pointing to the protected client, from where if I sign in and complete, I'll be back to the client side page. So you can add this extra. I don't know if this is a bug with the way that Next-Auth is reading the current paths inside of the app router or not, but the workaround for now is just to use this manually to redirect them and set this callback URL. Now, as I mentioned, once they're logged in or once there is a session, the user can actually see this page where I'm just showing their name. Now, before looking at protecting our server render pages, let's actually look at this header component where we're rendering this avatar and sign in button. So if I go back to my app folder, inside of this component folder, I can see this header component where I'm rendering different links, and also this sign in button. Now, this sign in button is a client side component with the inclusion of this use client directive, mainly because we're using this use session hook to check whether or not the user is logged in. If they are logged in, meaning that there is a session available, we're going to show this menu dropdown, which is built with headless UI, which is responsible for rendering this dropdown where we show some information about the user and maybe some links to a profile page where they can manage their account or a link to sign out. And if there is no session, excuse me, we're going to show this sign in button, which on click is going to call this sign in function from the Next-Auth package. And all this function does is that it redirects the user back to the sign in page and automatically sets the callback URL. Now, to just show you what or how we're actually signing out the user inside of this dropdown, there's two links, as I mentioned. One takes them to their profile page, if it exists, and the other one is just a button that on click calls a sign out function from Next-Auth package, which just signs the user out. Now, with this out of the way, let's actually look at protecting our server render pages. So if I go back to the app directory inside of our protected path, we can see this server folder and a page.jsx inside of it, which is responsible for rendering our server protected page. Now, by default, all of the pages, layouts, and components inside the app directory are going to be React server components, unless you indicate their client-side components with the use of this use client directive, as we've seen. And with React server components, first of all, you can turn them into async functions and fetch data or call asynchronous functions right inside your page component. And secondly, they're just going to run on the server. These components are not going to be executed or run on the client side, and no JavaScript is going to be shipped for these pages to the browser, to the user to run on the client side. Now, to get the session on the server side, we are going to use this new get server session function from the Next-Auth package. If I go back to the documentation for this get server session function, we see that we can call this function to get the session anywhere on the server side. If you're in the pages directory, this may be your get static props or get server-side props function, or your API endpoints. If you're using the app router or the app directory in Next.js 13, this is going to be your server components, just like how we're doing it now, or inside your route handlers, which are again your APIs running on the server side. And the way that it works, if you are using it inside get server-side props inside the pages directory, you have to export these auth options that you used to initialize your Next-Auth config. You have to export those options and actually pass those options together with the request and response to this get server session to get the session on the server side. This is an example of using this new function inside get server-side props, which is a function that you use to fetch data in Next.js 12 or inside the pages directory. But for the use in API routes or in the app directory, as you can see down here, you don't need to pass it the request and response object. The request object is going to be sent to this automatically. All you need to provide is this auth options that you use to initialize your package. So as you can see here, I'm using this auth options. If I go back to where I initialized my Next-Auth inside the API auth and this route.js, I'm exporting this auth options inside of my Next-Auth catch-all route so that I can pass this auth options to my get server session inside of my React server component as I'm doing it over here. Again, if you're using this get server session inside of the app router, you don't need to pass in the request and response object to it, just as we had to inside of the pages directory. Here, you only need to provide the same auth options you used to initialize Next-Auth config. With that, I would have the session. Again, if I have no session, I'm going to use this redirect function from the next navigation to redirect the user back to the sign-in page. And I'm manually again setting the callback URL to protected server. This is going to be read with the Next-Auth option so that once the sign-in flow is completed, the user is going to be redirected back to the protected page, in this case, the server page. So let's test this out actually going back to our application. So right now, if I go back to the home page, I'm logged in. If I go to the protected server page, I can see this is a server protected page and I'm logged in. Now, if I log out over here, it refreshes the page, realizes that I am not logged in, redirects me back to the sign-in page and sets the callback URL correctly to the protected server. So if I go ahead and now log back in here, I'm redirected back to the protected page on the server side and I'm logged back in. Now that we've looked at protecting our pages, whether they're rendered on the server or on the client side, let's actually look at protecting our API endpoint. So going back to our app directory, inside the API, I have this hello path and a route.js file inside of it, which turns this segment into an API endpoint. Let's look at this route.js file. As you can see, we're exporting a named get function from this file, which opens this route or endpoint to a get request. And inside of it, because this is running on the server, we're using this same get server session function from Next-Auth, passing the auth options to it. We're checking the session. If there is no session, we're going to use the next response, which is an extension of the response API. And it comes with some helper functions such as JSON. I'm sending a JSON message back to say you're not logged in. And if there is a session, I'm just going to use that session, retrieve the username out of it, and send it back as a JSON to this endpoint. So to test this out, let's go to /API /hello. We're right now logged in. So because I'm logged in, I'm getting my name back. If I go back to my application and actually sign out, now that I'm signed out, if I try to access that same endpoint of API hello, we see the message that you're not logged in. Now, as you can see, we can use this get server session function anywhere on the server to check whether or not the user is logged in and protect our React server components or server rendered pages or our API endpoints inside of our route handlers. That's a wrap for this video, folks. We added authentication to Next.js 13 using the app router, the new route handlers, and the Next-Auth package. We looked at protecting our pages, whether they're rendered on the server or on the client, we also looked at protecting our API endpoints or route handlers. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.